やはり日本も核武装の議論等を始めるべきタイミングなんじゃないかなと考えているんですが、いかがでしょうか。
Would Japan be better off today if it had nuclear weapons? The answer is yes. Nuclear weapons are the ultimate deterrent. The Germans will definitely rearm in a serious way that they will develop a good thing. Japan does not have nuclear weapons, so Japan would have to acquire nuclear weapons. That would be a hugely complicated and dangerous process for two reasons.
今台湾の問題が非常に日本でクローズアップされてますけれども、
It is almost impossible at this point in time for China to conquer Taiwan.
はい、皆さんこんにちは、三橋貴明です。本日はシカゴ大学のジョン・ミアシャイマー教授をお招き出しましてお話を伺いたいと思います。よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion as well.
まずロシア・ウクライナ戦争についてお聞きしたいんですけれども、ロシアのプーチン大統領がウクライナを侵略したのは地域覇権を目指したものなのか、それとも国家の究極の目的である生存が理由だったのか、どちらとお考えでしょうか。
Well, I think in the West, and this would include Japan, the conventional wisdom is that Putin is an imperialist and he invaded Ukraine because he wanted to conquer it and absorb it into a greater Russia. In other words, the conventional wisdom says that Putin is an imperialist. And of course, the belief is that when he was done conquering Ukraine, he would conquer other countries in Eastern Europe, and he would try to recreate the Soviet empire. My argument is that there is no evidence, zero evidence to support that view. And in fact, this was a preventive war, and it had to do mainly with NATO expansion. In 2008, the United States and its European allies said that they were going to expand NATO into Ukraine. They were going to make Ukraine a part of NATO. And in effect, Ukraine would become a major Western asset, a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And the Russians said at the time that this was categorically unacceptable, that this represented an existential threat to Russia, and that they would do everything possible to make sure it didn't happen. Result was, first you had a major crisis in February of 2014. This is when, as you remember, the Russians took Crimea. And second, you then had 8 years later, in February 2022, a major war that's ongoing now. So again, this is not a war of imperial conquest. This is a preventive war to, in effect, stop Ukraine from becoming part of NATO.
アメリカ側の話を聞きたいんですけれども、アメリカが主導したNATO の東方拡大というのは、そのロシアの地域覇権国家を防ぐというようなストラテジック、戦略的な話だったのか、それとも単なるリベラリズムなのか、どちらなんでしょうか。
Oh, I think there's no question that it was an example of liberal hegemony. It's very important to understand that NATO expansion started in the 1990s. The Clinton administration made the decision to expand NATO eastward in 1994. And Russia was not a serious threat to conquer any territory in 1994. Russia was economically and politically in terrible shape. It had just lost the Cold War. Its economy was struggling. Its military was in terrible shape. So there was no interest when NATO expansion started in containing the Russians. What we wanted to do was we wanted to take this set of institutions like NATO and the EU that we had created in Western Europe during the Cold War and move them eastward to bring the East European countries into those institutions. We also wanted to democratize those countries. This was the purpose of the color revolutions. And furthermore, we wanted to facilitate the growth of capitalism in Eastern Europe. We wanted to create a Europe, right, that went from the East to the West, that was very liberal in nature, that was incorporated into the liberal order. We did not see Boris Yeltsin's Russia as a threat. This was not containment. From the perspective of 2025, because of the ongoing war in Ukraine, people might think that that NATO expansion was designed to contain Russia. But Russia in the 1990s, when NATO expansion started, didn't need to be contained. So this is a war in pursuit of what I call liberal hegemony. It's not a realist-based war.
リベラルヘゲモニーですね。ロシアの侵攻をストップして、それで欧州でバランスオブパワーを復活させるには、例えばドイツの核武装、あるいは軍事大国化というのをそのオフショアバランサーとしてのアメリカが認める必要があるんではないかと考えるんですが、いかがでしょうか。
The big question here, in response to your question, is what does the United States do in Europe? Now, I think a very powerful case can be made that the United States is interested in greatly reducing its military presence in Europe and pivoting to East Asia, because the Chinese threat is the primary threat that the United States faces. So if the United States greatly reduces its military footprint in Europe, and especially if it leaves NATO, if the United States leaves NATO, then the European countries, to include Germany, are on their own. They must then provide for their own security against Russia, which they see today as a serious threat. I think if the United States is to greatly reduce its military presence in Europe, or to leave Europe altogether, that the Germans will definitely rearm in a serious way because they fear the Russians. And I think there is a very good chance that they will develop nuclear weapons of their own, because they will no longer have the American nuclear umbrella over their head. You want to remember that since 1949, when NATO was created, all of the countries of Western Europe, since 1949 up to the present, have had the American security umbrella, and more particularly, the American nuclear umbrella over their heads. But in the situation that we're talking about here, where the United States leaves Europe, the security umbrella, the nuclear umbrella, is gone. And the incentives for Germany to get nuclear weapons are very great. And certainly they will rearm in a serious way.
一宮シャイマーファンとして伺いたいんですけれども、その日半球の地域覇権国であるアメリカ合衆国にとって、その他のやっぱり大陸、ユーラシアとかに別の地域覇権国が登場するのは許せないというような、そういう戦略的な観点はあるんでしょうか。
That's absolutely true. I actually two regional hegemons. In particular, if the United States, which is already a regional hegemon, faced a regional hegemon in East Asia, which is, of course, China. And the argument that we make is that this would be unacceptable to the United States, because a Chinese hegemon in East Asia would be free to roam into the Western Hemisphere. Very important to understand that one of the reasons that the United States military has bases all over the world and interferes in the politics of countries all over the world is because it has no threats in the Western Hemisphere. The United States is so secure in the Western Hemisphere that it's free to roam all over the earth, interfering in the politics of every country on the planet. Well, China now is in effect pinned down in East Asia. China has to worry about the balance of power in East Asia. It's not free to roam in the way that the United States is free to roam. So if we imagine a situation where China is a hegemon in East Asia and is free to roam, it can roam into the Western Hemisphere. And that's unacceptable to the United States. And this, of course, is why the United States will go to great lengths to make sure that China does not dominate East Asia.
実際中国は、パナマであったりベネズエラにかなり、なんていうんでしょう、干渉しているように見えるんで、そういうようなことを西半球でそういうことをやられるのがアメリカにとっては絶対に許されないっていうことなんですね。
Well, as you know, the United States has what's called the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine says that countries like China and countries like the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and before that, Imperial Germany and Nazi Germany, they could not form military alliances with countries in the Western Hemisphere, and they could not deploy their own military forces in the Western Hemisphere. That's what the Monroe Doctrine says. The Monroe Doctrine says we, the United States, own the Western Hemisphere, and no distant great power can put military forces in the Western Hemisphere or form a military alliance with a country in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the Chinese have not formed a military alliance with Venezuela. They have not deployed any military forces in the Western Hemisphere. And if they were to do that, the United States would go to great lengths to stop it immediately, just as we did in 1962 when the Soviets put nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. That's unacceptable to the United States. So there's no question that today the Chinese have significant economic influence in the Western Hemisphere. But economic influence is different than military influence. And up to this point, the Chinese have not done anything militarily to wield power in the Western Hemisphere, which of course would violate the would violate the Monroe Doctrine, and it would prompt an immediate American response.
東アジアにおいて、アメリカが、中国の地域覇権国家を許さないといった場合、やはり日本がバランスになる、あるいはバックパッシング、要は責任転嫁をされるという形で、日本も必ず防衛力を強化しないといけないという形になると思うんですけど、アメリカは実際そういう動きをしてますけれども、その認識で正しいでしょうか？
I think that the United States is profoundly committed to containing China and preventing it from becoming a regional hegemon. And I think if you look at the recent national security strategy of the United States that President Trump released on December 4th of this year, 2025, what you see very clearly is the United States is committed to containing China. Now, what does this say about America's relationship with Japan? You ask if whether the United States would try to buck pass to Japan, in other words, get Japan to do most of the balancing against China. I think that is not going to happen. I think the United States and Japan fully understand that they have to work together. They have to have a close alliance to contain China. And that buck passing from the United States to Japan would be disastrous. And the reason is that China is already so powerful and will become even more powerful with the passage of time. The United States and Japan are going to have a very difficult time containing China because it is so powerful and it is going to get more powerful. And if Japan or the United States started to pursue a buck passing strategy, they would both be behaving foolishly. And I do not think they will behave foolishly. I think the United States and Japan will work together to contain China.
世界がなんかアナーキーであるというのは全くその通りで、特にロシアのウクライナ侵略によって証明されたと思うんですけども、最終的には日本にとってもアメリカが真の意味で永遠に未来永劫、友人というか同盟関係でいられるかというのはこれは分からないということで、やはり日本も核武装の議論等を始めるべきタイミングなんじゃないかなと考えているんですが、いかがでしょうか。
I think this is a very complicated matter. I think if you asked the question, would Japan be better off today if it had nuclear weapons? The answer is yes. Nuclear weapons are the ultimate deterrent. And if Japan had nuclear weapons today, the way Britain and France have nuclear weapons, or China and the United States have nuclear weapons, that would be a good thing. But the fact is, as everybody knows, Japan does not have nuclear weapons. So Japan would have to acquire nuclear weapons. That would be a hugely complicated and dangerous process for two reasons. One is because the United States would oppose it. The United States does not want Japan to have nuclear weapons. And furthermore, the Chinese do not want Japan to have nuclear weapons. So Japan acquiring nuclear weapons would be a problematic enterprise. However, the good news is that the American nuclear umbrella is over China's head at this point in time, and it is not going to go away in all likelihood. So the Japanese face a second best situation here. They have the American nuclear umbrella over their heads. It would be better if they had their own nuclear weapons, if Japan had its own nuclear weapons, but that's not the case. And given that it would be a real problem for Japan to acquire nuclear weapons, the fact that the Japanese now have nuclear deterrence in the form of the American nuclear umbrella, that's an acceptable, in my opinion, second best alternative.
今台湾の問題が非常に日本でクローズアップされてますけれども、教授の、水の停止力、The Stopping Power of Water というのは台湾においても有効なんでしょうか。
I think that there's no question that because the Chinese would have to launch an amphibious assault across the Taiwan Straits, the stopping power of water would greatly limit their ability to invade and conquer Taiwan. If Taiwan was physically attached to mainland China, if the South China Sea, if the Taiwan Straits did not separate Taiwan from mainland China, it would be much more difficult for Taiwan and its allies to defend itself. But I believe that because of the stopping power of water, that it is almost impossible at this point in time for China to conquer Taiwan if the United States and Japan are fighting with Taiwan from the beginning. In other words, if the Chinese have to conquer Taiwan by going up against the Taiwanese, the Americans, the Japanese, and maybe the Australians as well, I think they will not attack because they will understand that it is almost impossible to conquer Taiwan. I think if the Japanese and the Americans do not help the Taiwanese defend their island, then the Chinese will be able to conquer Taiwan. It will not be easy, but it will be possible. So I think that for deterrence purposes, if the Americans and the Japanese are there to help the Taiwanese, the Chinese will not attack.
アナーキーが国際システムの基本であるというのはその通りだと思うんですけども、多くの人が例えば国際連合を世界政府のように認識してしまったりとか、あるいはそのアメリカのリベラリズム的な思想に共感してしまうのはそもそもなんでなんでしょうか。
I think a liberal view of international politics is much more attractive to most people than a realist view. A realist view of international politics paints a very dark picture of international relations. A realist view, as you know, says that you have endless security competition. The great powers are always competing with each other. And furthermore, there is always the possibility of competition turning into a great power war. From the average person's point of view, who wants to live in a world like that? You would rather live in a more peaceful world. So a liberal theories of international politics portray a more hopeful and more optimistic world. They say that there are different ways that we can improve relations among the great powers, and we can promise a much greater likelihood of peace. We can escape from that bleak world that people like John Mearsheimer describe. Now, that's very intuitively attractive, because again, who wants to live in a realist world? But my argument is, as long as you live in an anarchic system, a system where there's no higher authority that can rescue states if they get into trouble, you can't escape this iron cage that states are in. In other words, you can't escape realist logic. In a competition between realist logic on one side and liberal logic on the other side, realist logic wins every time. Now, I fully understand that most people don't want to hear that, especially in academia, here in Japan or in the United States. Academia is filled with liberal idealists. But I'm sorry, that's not the way the world works. We live in a realist world, and I think it makes the most sense to understand that and do everything that we can to minimize the chances that that security competition, which I think is baked into the system, will not turn into a real war.
最後の質問です。国家は生存のための合理的なアクターであるべきというのはその通りだと思うんですけども、戦略的に合理的に行動できない国があったとしたら、日本のことなんですけどもその場合はどういう運命になるんでしょうか。
Well, I think that if a country behaves irrationally, it is highly likely to end up getting into serious trouble. Because if a country pursues an irrational policy, it has an irrational way of thinking about the world, that policy is very likely to lead to disaster. So it makes much more sense for a state to act in a rational way, to put it in slightly different terms, to act in strategically smart ways. Nevertheless, it is very important to understand that even when states act in strategically smart ways, they still run the possibility, there still is the chance that the policy they pursue will end up leading to disaster. Because the fact of the matter is that there are all sorts of unanticipated consequences you can't predict, that will lead a state pursuing a smart policy or a rational policy to end up losing in the end. But there's no question that in the final analysis, it's much better for a state to act rationally than it is to act irrationally. And of course, that's intuitively plausible. That seems to be commonsensical for good reasons.
ありがとうございます。最後にですね、教授に日本の視聴者に向けて、ミア・シャイマーの本を読む意義というのもお話しいただきたいと思います。
I certainly will do that. I've written 2 books that have been published by this publishing house, and I greatly appreciate that. The first is called The Great Delusion, and this dealt with what the consequences were of the United States pursuing a liberal foreign policy during the unipolar moment, which ran from roughly 1992 up until 2017. During that period, the United States pursued a policy which I call liberal hegemony. In my opinion, it was a remarkably foolish policy, and it got the United States and other countries into a lot of trouble. So that's the story that I tell in The Great Delusion. In the second book, How States Think, I address the all-important question of whether states act rationally or not. It's become the case in recent years, certainly in the United States, but I think in the West more generally, that many people believe that great powers behave irrationally. They behave foolishly almost all of the time. And what I did with my co-author, Sebastian Rosado, is try to examine that question, whether states behave irrationally most of the time, or whether they routinely behave rationally. And what we did was we came up with a very new way of thinking about how to account for rationality, how to think about rationality. And then we applied that basic framework that we developed to a whole series of cases. And we asked the simple question, does the historical record show that states mainly behave rationally or that they mainly behave irrationally? And we came to the conclusion that most of the time, states behave rationally. They do not behave irrationally that often. That's not to say that they don't behave irrationally on occasion, because they do, and that includes the United States. But the good news is that most of the time, states behave as rational actors.
ありがとうございました。大変勉強になりました。Thank you very much, Professor Miyashima.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for your excellent questions.
世界で3033万回再生されたこの授業を知ってますか？シカゴ大学の宮シャイマー教授の講義です。なぜこれほど注目されたのか。それはウクライナ危機の原因がプーチンではなくアメリカ側にあることを言い当てていたからです。さらに宮シャイマー教授は33年前の1993年の時点でアメリカ側が原因でウクライナ危機が勃発する可能性があるとすでに警告していました。しかし日本ではこうした話はほとんど語られません。だからこそミアシャイマー教授がウクライナ戦争を言い当てたとも言われる一冊が日本で出版されました。こちらです。リベラリズムという妄想。この本を読むと正直驚くと思います。なぜならウクライナ戦争はプーチンの暴走ではなく、むしろアメリカ側が引き起こしたことが事実ベースでわかるからです。例えばウクライナ危機は戦争の8年前、2013年の11月から始まっていました。この時、ウクライナ政権をひっくり返すあるクーデターが起こったのですが、裏でアメリカが関与していた証拠が出てきたんです。また、オバマ政権の外交官による通話記録がリークされました。その中では、次のウクライナ首相を誰にするのか、名指しで話されており、実際その通りになったんです。さらに、プーチンは戦争が起こる前に、越えてはならない一線を明確にアメリカに警告していました。それにもかかわらず、アメリカ側がその一線を越えたことで、ウクライナ危機が引き返せない段階へと突入していったという事実も書かれています。ウクライナ戦争、そして国際政治を見る目がガラッと変わる名著なので、ぜひお読みください。ちなみに私は宮シャイマー教授の影響をめちゃくちゃ受けています。そのまま言葉引用すると恥ずかしいので、使ってませんでしたけれどもね。実はこの本、Amazon で8780円で転売されていました。しかし今回、宮シャイマー教授の来日を記念して本体価格3630円のところ、1月18日までならば 10% オフの3267円で手に入るようです。ただし、在庫の420冊がなくなり次第予約販売になるらしいので、今すぐご確認ください。また、在庫切れでもすぐ読めるように、電子書籍がセットで手に入るプランも用意されています。今すぐ手に入れて、ウクライナ戦争の裏側を知ってください。
こちらの書籍、リベラリズムという妄想の本体価格は3630円ですが、1月18日までの期間限定で 10% オフの3267円で手に入れることができます。あなたもぜひこの本を読んでウクライナ戦争の裏側を知ってください。期間限定のご案内ですので今のうちにお申し込みください。